Oh, great.
Ian, do you want to go?
Okay. Well, tonight is going to be a highlight of this term, if not this year. It's a great honor and a fantastic privilege to have Megan Biesele talking to us tonight. Megan is a pioneering anthropologist who's worked all her life, really, with the Juhuasi Bushmen of the Kalahari. She joined the Harvard Kalahari Bushman group in, well, she went into the field in 1970. So that's 53 years ago. She was the only member of the group. This was the group headed up or initiated by Richard Lee. She was the only member really dedicated to the classic ideational concerns of sociocultural anthropology. Everyone else was, in a sense, measuring and counting, building and expanding on Richard Lee's work in the mid-60s. Pat Draper and Henry Harpending gave an introduction to the Juhua language, but it was Hoan of Dobe who acted as her language teacher for the first few years, and then translator, interpreter with other languages. Megan submitted her thesis, Folklore and Ritual of Kung Hunter-Gatherers, at the end of 1974. It was to take almost 20 years for this to be transformed into a book. And what is now a classic, Women Like Meat, the folklore and foraging ideology of the Juhuan. I was in South Africa at Wits University when David Lewis Williams organized the book's launch in 1993, it being a joint publication between Indiana and Wits. It was no accident that David had taken on this role. Megan had introduced him to the Juhuansi shortly after her thesis submission in 1975, and together they produced eland hunting rituals among northern and southern San groups, striking similarities, which was to revolutionize our understanding of Bushman religion. Unfortunately, I was too wrapped up in my own obsessions, looking and counting pieces of ochre in archaeological assemblages, to attend the book launch. And it was to be another 20 years before we finally met at the conference on hunter-gatherer studies in Liverpool. Her talk tonight is called The Elephant Girl and the Buffalo Wife, San Narratives, Exegesis, and Evolution. Megan starts with Helga Vierich's compelling retelling to R.A.G of the Buffalo Wife story she heard from Kua San in northeastern Botswana. This was a story, this was a R.A.G session about a year ago, I think. And this was recorded, like Megan's, in the 1970s. Helga's story eerily echoes those of Megan, recorded in northwestern Botswana at around the same time, with the Juhuan elephant girl. Both address basic problems. One being that people's food prominently includes sentient beings. But her retold version appears to answer questions posed by what look like gaps puzzling to a Western audience in the versions Megan collected. Helga and Megan have since discussed differences between their field conditions of recording, audience, and translation. And these help us to understand why her version supplies what might be called an exegesis of the tale, whereas Megan's does not. And the conclusion, I think, is that as in biological evolution, each version is a random existential experiment in making sense for one audience in one place and moment in time. So without any more, I'll pass on to Megan.
Thank you so much, Ian. That's a wonderful introduction. And I'd like to thank the Radical Anthropology Group for their invitation to participate in this marvelous series of talks that you have. I'm very selfishly glad to be here because to speak to this particular audience is a great privilege for me. And I'm extremely interested to hear comments, questions, and perhaps even stories of one's own similar experiences. The way I've tentatively organized it is in two parts. The first part to deal, as Ian said, with Helga's story and comparing it with my story and drawing some conclusions from that. Then a discussion. And after that, a brief part two, in which I intend to offer some comments on Graeber and Wengrow's book, The Dawn of Everything, as it relates to my presentation. And maybe some last question and discussion time after that. Well, one big difference between me and Helga has to do with the great divide between the oral and the scribal worlds. Helga lives not only professionally in the scribal world, but she is also a gifted oral storyteller, and I'm not. Thus, I'm going to be summarizing from transcriptions and translations that I and the Junquois transcription group have labored over. The Junquoisi called me a paper person from the beginning, a kanujua, and I readily accept the truth of their assessment. A kanujua basically means a literate person or a book person, but literally it says paper person. In my career, I labored a lot with the kind of bubble that is circumscribed around a literate person in trying to understand an oral tradition. So I have fairly recently finished writing a memoir of the process of permeating the walls of that bubble to try to understand the oral tradition of the Junquoisi and other San. This memoir is called Once Upon a Time is Now. And I wrote it about the first 18 months of my Kalahari fieldwork, which took place between 1970 and 72. And it was during that time period that I recorded most of the folktales in my collection. Well, for those who did not have the wonderful chance of hearing Helga tell her story, I'm just going to summarize hers and then go on to summarize mine in comparison. Helga tells the Buffalo Wife story with motifs and themes that include an uncanny younger brother whose elder brother has mistakenly married a buffalo. And the younger brother appears as an embodiment of the creator or of God, gets himself miraculously born by emerging from their mother's stomach so he can correct the mistake that his brother has made in marrying the buffalo. He journeys to the land of the buffalo, collecting wild foods and creating fire and cooked foods along the way, kills the wife and unborn child, introduces the elder brother to the taste of cooked meat. Meanwhile, the uterine fluid from the pregnant wife who has been murdered goes back to the camp of the buffaloes, alerting them to the fact of the murder. Then the buffaloes come to avenge this murder. The younger brother shelters his elder brother by causing a termite mound to open so he can go inside. The younger brother, the buffaloes learn of their mistake in marrying their daughter to a human being. This human being smells bad because he has eaten meat, and his poisonous farts kill the buffalo avengers, and the brothers go back to their mother's camp. The mother is shocked at first, but soon learns to like the taste of cooked meat, appreciates skin bags and nets. So handily, we have an account of the origin of several enabling features of the so-called hunting-gathering adaptation. Interestingly, Helga told me that in another version of this story, it is not the farts that kill the buffaloes, but it is the use of a horn. I'm not sure what kind of horn, but I mention this because you will see that there's a parallel in the story that I'm going to go through before I start asking the questions that I asked Helga after I heard her version. My Juntois version, in which the animal wife ranges across characters, including not only an elephant, but the python girl, the aardvark girl, the eland girl, echoes virtually all of the motifs in Helga's story. But each variant contains not all of them, but makes a coherent story emphasizing some of them. However, none of them contains the degree of exegesis of the sacred story. Helga specifically asked for a sacred story. Contains that exegesis that Helga's story does, which led me to communicate with Helga since about last April about the conditions of her collection, including the audience, how the storytelling session was convened, as much as possible about the use of translators, recording technology, possible pauses in the storytelling during which exegesis might have been offered for Helga's own benefit. So there were fascinating similarities as well as differences in the ways that she and I worked. And I was very struck by the way the exegesis her version offered seemed to fill in gaps in those I collected. I was also struck by the similarity between her story's resolution of the human problem about food prominently including sentient beings that must be murdered prior to being eaten. When Helga told her story, I was, of course, immediately reminded of Rasmussen's Igloolik Inuit quote, "Life's greatest danger exists in the fact that man's food consists entirely of souls." Shivers your timbers. Anyway, the exegesis contained in Helga's retelling of the story, which she got from R.A.G, her storyteller and informant, suddenly seemed to resolve enigmas that I had lived with for decades. Some of these were the identity of the uncanny younger brother, the purpose and intent of his journey. But why had I never gotten the explanations that Helga had that allowed this convincing retelling that seemed to tie up all the loose ends, basically the solution to the conundrum of how humans can consume meat despite animals having souls? My answer lies particularly in differences between the way I collected, transcribed, and translated the stories to render them in written rather than oral form, and Helga's more immediate grasp of the meaning from the one spectacular story she heard and wrote notes on. I believe that the similarities and differences in our collecting can complement each other. Absolutely no criticism is meant of Helga's approach. My approach was different because I was living in a basically scribal world when I suddenly landed in this oral world and didn't know how to deal with it until much later. For one thing, translation itself is always a form of exegesis. Oral and written are worlds apart in terms of experience and its presentation. And then there are all sorts of picky little Western presentational choices that can intrude on even the intent of the way the story was told in the first place. One of these is, for instance, in the choice of whether so can be translated as woman or girl or wife. This has a lot to do with the status of this character, buffalo wife versus elephant girl. These were choices we made. Capitalizations of names, presenting the episodes all run on together or as separate stories with separate titles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that Helga and I had in common, though, in our approach was that we convened our storytellers and their audiences around full stew pots, which was key to setting the right atmosphere. But Helga was a fully participating member of the audience, and she was focused on the content of the story at the time, asking questions, making full use of interpreters, and included by the storyteller among those for whom the particular performance would need to be meaningful. I, in contrast, was busily focused on linguistic authenticity, recording all the versions I could get without interrupting for explanations, even before I understood the language fully enough to get the meaning, and sometimes understanding even the basic action of the story only decades later. My storytellers were telling their stories for their own people to hear, and so my own participation was largely technical. Thus, what often remained elusive for me in the stories was already richly allusive for the Jeune audiences. Motifs and themes for them, who had heard different versions of these stories so often in their lives that the last thing they needed was exegesis or even completeness in the variants, set off a highly textured set of reverberations in the audience's minds as they were used anew by successive storytellers. And their power lay in the stories not being openly didactic. This is a very, very important point. Rather, they used their allusive power to inculcate strong messages, rather as does a great interreferential body of literature. Now, this idea of comparing this body of recordings to a body of literature was one of the ways that I, as a paper person, began to comprehend the great strength and power of the oral tradition, and also its massive, massive variability. One of the other things Helga and I discussed was the fact that children, even though they may very well have heard the stories often in their lives already, often appeared terrifically shocked. And Elizabeth Marshall Thomas also remarked on that. The shock on the faces of the children when adults were doing really terrible, dastardly deeds in the stories. But their shock did not mean, in my opinion, that most of the children were hearing the stories for the first time. Instead, the apparent shock, I believe, came from the joy of hearing yet again a permutation of a shocking story that carried a timeless, incrementally learned message. Anyway, what child can we imagine who wants to hear a good story only once? So both Helga and I invited groups of people, and we provided food. In my case, the idea to do this was inspired by Mel Connor's and Nick Burton Jones's, quote, seminar method for obtaining information about animal behavior, where they brought groups of elders together to tell hunting stories and to explore animal behavior knowledge in that way. So I'm going to read you now my summary of the Elephant Girl story, and I think that you will see some of the great similarities with Helga's story. I'm reading out of a collection called Juntois Folktales, Transcriptions and English Translations, that was published by me and the Juntois Transcription Group, which the transcription group was begun in 1992 and is still active today. So the beautiful elephant girl. The elephant girl's husband's younger brother was still in his mother's stomach when his older brother married the elephant girl. After the marriage, the elephant girl's husband brought her to his mother's village to live, and she gave birth to a daughter there. But there were no elderly people living at that village, so the elephant girl and her husband planned to visit his older relatives at other villages to ask for gifts for the child. The elephant girl planned to leave her daughter with a woman there, while she and her husband went visiting. The night before they were to leave, the elephant girl and her husband slept at his mother's village. The mother's stomach grew, and she was about to give birth. In the morning, her older son, the elephant girl's husband, was packing to leave. His mother was grinding ochre and rubbing her stomach with it. Then her newborn son jumped straight up out of her stomach, saying, "Mother, rub your hands on my head so that I can go with my older brother." Everyone was astonished, but one of them said, "This is a sky's thing, so just do what he says. Let him go on the journey with his older brother." So his mother rubbed him with ochre and fat, and he left with his older brother. At one of the villages of the old people, the husband was requested to bring his daughter so they could see her. He agreed, and they were walking to fetch the child at the other village. As they were walking past a termite mound, the younger brother stepped on a thorn and cried, "Ouch, ouch, ouch." Then he took off his shoes and threw them away, saying they should go off and become vultures that drop down on meat. Then the younger brother said, "Run, older brother, go see what those vultures are dropping on and get meat for us to eat." Meanwhile, the older brother's wife, the elephant girl, was wearing a skin apron with a well-sharpened metal awl stuck in its waistband. The younger brother asked his brother's wife to use the awl to pull out the thorn from his foot. The elephant girl believed what he said and came close. He took the awl and killed her. The elephant girl had already told her grandmother that she didn't trust her husband's younger brother. She had said, "My thoughts don't agree with a thing that jumps out of its mother's stomach saying it wants to accompany its older brother. So watch well. A little wind will come to you with droplets of my blood and will stick to your groin. Take the bit of blood and put it into something like a little bowl or a jar." And indeed, the little wind with the blood came to the grandmother and stuck to her. The grandmother said in her heart, "Isn't this just what the child said would happen?" She took the blood and put it in a jar and lived and thought. She said to herself, "If they've already completed what she told me, there's nothing more to be done." Meanwhile, the elephant girl's brothers went to follow her husband and his younger brother to see if they had arrived safely at the village with their sister. In fact, the older brother had gone off and had not found the vultures and was returning to where his younger brother was. The younger brother had killed and skinned his older brother's wife, the elephant girl, and had roasted her and was cutting up and eating her fat. The older brother arrived and, not seeing his wife, asked what kind of meat it was. The younger brother told him not to ask so many questions, but just to come and taste the meat. "Why do you call that which is meat a woman?" asked the younger brother. The older brother was greatly upset and asked his younger brother how he would manage to remain alive if he ate a piece of his own wife. "Stick with me," said the younger brother, insisting again that it was plain meat. Finally, the older brother took a piece and ate it. At that moment, the brothers of the elephant girl, having tracked the two, were seen approaching. The younger brother told the termite mound to break open so his brother could enter and avoid the anger that was coming his way. The termite mound obeyed, and the older brother stepped in. The mound closed. The younger brother stood alone outside, and when the elephant girl's brothers tried to stab him, he perched on the points of their spears like the little bird called Omhaya. He dodged their spears, perching on their heads, perching on their noses, and perching on their other body parts, and eventually defeated them completely. They left him and went off. This Omhaya, by the way, is a kind of sparrow that acts like that, perching different places so it can never be caught. The older brother jumped out of the termite mound, and the two of them took the meat and went home to their village. The people asked, "What have you done with the woman whose child is standing over there? What kind of meat is it that you are walking around with your stomachs full of? You two have done something very wrong." Meanwhile, the bit of blood stayed in the grandmother's jar and grew. The grandmother put it into a skin bag, and it grew some more. It split the bag, so she put it into something larger. It grew and split that too. Only the grandmother knew what she was doing and kept her intention, growing the blood into a regular big woman again. Finally, the elephant girl was the size of a sack. One day, the women of that village said they would go gathering raisin berries, and they took the child along with them. The grandmother spent the day alone at the village. When the sun was getting low, she spread a reed mat in the shade and took out the elephant girl and set her on the mat. She ground ochre and spread it on her, fixed her and dressed her and hung her with ornaments, and fastened copper rings into her hair. She was the beautiful elephant girl again. When the women were coming back from gathering, they heard the old woman speaking to someone, and that someone was laughing in response. The child asked, "Who is laughing in the village? That sounds like my dead mother." The older women thought the child was crazy, but then the elephant girl laughed again, and they all began to wonder. They arrived in the village and saw her sitting there. Her daughter cried, "It's my mother," and dropped down and began to nurse. The other women asked, "Who has done this?" The elephant girl replied, "Granny, of course, Granny alone. The old people give you life." Another day, the two who had killed her came back to the village, and seeing her, got a fright. But they still wanted to take the elephant girl to visit her in-laws. The grandmother secretly gave her a magical Gemsbok horn and told her how to use it when she arrived at the in-laws' village. The elephant girl then left with her husband and his younger brother, and they traveled a long distance. As they traveled, the elephant girl kept asking them to let her know before they arrived at the village. She asked about mountains and riverbeds with water and what the distance was between where they were and the village they would be visiting. Finally, they passed a hill, then a valley of soft sand, and another hill, and came to a village beyond, where small children with clean tummies were playing around and laughing. The brothers told her this was the place. The elephant girl told them to go ahead of her into the village, that she wanted to powder herself, and then she would follow them in. When the two brothers had entered the village, she took out her magical Gemsbok horn and blew on it, saying, "These two brothers and their village shall be broken apart and ruined." The horn blew down the village, flattened it to the ground. Then the beautiful elephant girl walked home. This story ends. I'm happy to say that there are other versions of this story that have other ramifications to the endings. In one of them, for instance, the heroine, who at that point is an eland, doesn't just go home. She goes home to her people. She extracts her own heart and she gives it to them so that they may have food to eat. So what I'll do next is I'd like to read you an extract from the memoir that I've written about the 18 months that I spent between 1970 and 72, collecting, recording as many of the stories as I could get. I debated about how best to set up the storytelling sessions. I knew that unless food was provided, some large proportion of the Kauri people would have to be out in the bush each day hunting, gathering, collecting firewood, carrying water. I wanted a big enough group to provide the audience needed for vibrant storytelling. I resolved to experiment with solutions to this problem. My first experimental solution was to set up a retreat-like atmosphere, a kind of vacation for storytellers. I was lucky. This worked so well, I never had to look for an alternative. I invited the old people at Kauri, where I had moved after an initial period at Dobie at the Harvard camp. The Kauri people, ranging in number from 4 to 8, depending on their visiting relatives, who came from as far away as Trai or even the Dobie area to stay with me at my camp for a week at a time. They brought their own sleeping skins and blankets, and they slept around our communal cooking and talking fire. I had a few extra tents where they could sleep in case of rain. I would have enough staples and tinned foods stockpiled to feed them for the week, and we all cooked and ate together. Often the younger people brought fresh wild meat, like kudu, wildebeest, or buffalo, or slingshot guinea fowls that I could pay or trade for. The old people were delighted not to have to search for food during the weeks they were with me. And as I had hoped, they relaxed into our retreat-like atmosphere of full-time storytelling. The fact that this kind of hospitality exchange was comfortable for both me and the Juntoisi made the storytelling arrangement delightful and productive. I got up each morning wondering what unexpected bounty, in terms of both unpredictable wild food we could share and of further sharing of stories the day might bring. I knew that all the stories were involving many activities and problem solving of everyday life. So it was my intention not only to get as broad a collection of Juntois oral tradition and understand its content as I could, but also to understand environmental references and activity references. So it was a period of full immersion in whatever Juntoisi were doing on a given day and in their stories. My mentor, Lorna Marshall, and her daughter, Elizabeth Marshall Thomas, had written down quite a number of the Juntois stories in English during their fieldwork in the 1950s. And they worked through great interpreters like the famous Colonel Ledimo. I wanted to follow up on their lead by providing both authentic recordings in Juntoisi and a sense of the tradition as a whole. I saw my role as a dual one, including not only recording and documentation of verbal materials, but also ethnographic and environmental contextualization. I was first told a series of elaborate and bawdy stories about tricks played by women upon men, alternating with retaliation by men on the women. The storytelling grew more and more hilarious with each episode. One of the older women explained to me that the man began all the trouble, as she said. So for a while, I thought that Kauha, one of the many names of a male trickster back in the times, quote, when the animals were still people, was always the initiator of the tricks. He was when the storytellers were women. But one day I heard the story from an old man. Kwang has been telling you all wrong, he said jocularly. She hasn't told you it was the women who began it in the beginning. He then proceeded to tell the story himself, starting out. The women lived and thought, what should we do to this man? In general, the women tricked their husband into eating their sexual parts or falling into a pit of sexual secretions or excrement. The husband, in turn, tricks them into biting into his testicles or anus or makes love to them in the guise of dead meat. Mel Connor had told me he collected a version of this story in which the husband is reconstituted after one such episode from his own penis, which the wives have just discarded, thinking it was only the penis of an aardvark. In some versions, both Kauha and his wives get into each other's stomachs by pretending to be plant food and then laugh or giggle there, making life unbearable. One storyteller explicitly said that Kauha wanted to make love to the women, so he tricked his way inside them by turning into ripe kitoa, which looks like a red cucumber. When the wives are eaten in turn, they sometimes pop right out through Kauha's stomach wall, and he has to be sewn up again by obliging flies. This is the same thing you did to us, the wives crow. Well, we had a lot of fun laughing at these stories as they were elaborated day by day. And part of the fun was the worth given to each individual storyteller's rendition of the various stories. You never knew what the next storyteller would want to incorporate or emphasize in a given story on a given day. People insisted fiercely on each person's right to tell the story in his or her own way. In many oral traditions, stories vary around a core set of values, themes, and beliefs, and this variability added a great deal to the richness of the experience of hearing Jinqua stories. So no exegesis was necessary in the variants that I collected. The exegesis was definitely not needed by community members who had heard these stories in different permutations hundreds of times. They were deeply needed by me, who didn't get the sense of the stories from the fragmentary versions that I heard. But it came to me a bit later that this fragmentation of the versions that I had collected was a pretty fair reflection of the ways that these stories were being told to the Jinqua audience. I was just there as a technician turning tape recorder on and off. The people were hearing stories that, though fragmentary, referred in every instance to well-known plots. And so what they were appreciating was the way that different storytellers were ringing the changes on the ways that the stories could be told. This was true of men's stories, as well as of so-called women's stories like The Elephant Girl. I wish I had time to go through these wonderful stories for you, many of which refer to magical practices and the healing dance. The beliefs are omnipresent in these stories in the form of very subtle, unexplained metaphors. The stories about the trickster god, for instance, point to the origin of the healing powers in the dance context through the use of animal abilities, substances, or surrogates, such as tortoise shells, eland fat, and horns, information provided by bird familiars, etc. But they do so without exegesis. Wow, I asked myself, why would hanging horns in a tree bring down magic lightning? Why would powdering oneself with aromatic root powder allow relief from having killed something? Why would sniffing smoke from a fat fire made inside a tortoise shell enable a person to trance? Teasing out these references in the stories led me into ritual contexts whose sideways elusiveness provided ever more richness to the texture of meaning in the tales. There were very close relationships between how information was communicated and remembered and the people's achievement of daily subsistence. There was a lot of information about animal behavior and also how humans ought to behave in relationship to the animals. Storytelling community members and the Morrissey, or gathering territories in which they lived, were part parts of mental maps they were making to the important assets of their lives. Not only the water sources, I learned, the wild food areas, the hunting grounds were included in these knowledge maps, but also Jusakranchisi, people who know things. These people who know things included not just sages, not just healers, not just old people full of environmental wisdom, but also musical composers, expert trackers, excellent dancers whose work they could enjoy and learn from. Taken together, the interlocking Morrissey formed a reliable mental map of physical and spiritual community resources that were open to everyone. I came to see that this dazzling resource map was made possible not only by the leveling mechanisms of their sharing system, but by lack of competitiveness in creative achievement. Beautiful things like medicine songs were seen to come through people, to belong to everyone, and were to be used and celebrated by all. There seemed to be a precise parallel here to the modesty of Juntois hunters about the animals they killed. The meat they brought in for the community through quietly doing their job as hunters did not bring them personal glory. It was meat destined for every member of the group. So there was a parallel, I found, between the sharing of meat and of powerful created beauty. So it's hard to emphasize enough how the storytellers and healers I had met all seemed to fit, along with the rest of the Juntois people, one creative community. The same augmenting and reinforcing meanings crossed all the media I had encountered and were freely shared. I never got the sense that knowledge or meanings or artistic skill were being sequestered by anyone. Rather, they seemed joyfully accessible to all. So I saw the Juntois artists as spiritual guides who could not do other than pursue their artistry. I decided when writing my memoir to include profiles of these spiritual guides. There's one of a composer of thumb piano songs, many of storytellers, men healers, women healers, of the women and girls who sang for the dancers or played the lute like 5-string gouache. All were viewed as channels to the beyond, giving access to other realms of aesthetic enjoyment, of knowledge, of health and welfare for everyone. These artists readily acknowledged and often acknowledged the people from whom they learned. So this sense that I had of having somehow landed in a creative community of individuals functioning for each other as well as for themselves was beyond anything I had ever experienced. It was beyond my wildest dreams. I told myself a collective work of art like I had observed here, such as the constant dialogue among living stories, or the gorgeous achievement of song and movement that was the healing dance, must be no less a work of art than what we in the West call, quote, a work of art. In fact, I marveled at how very much more art and social genius it must take for individuals to coordinate themselves in these ways that I had seen. I saw that the healing narratives and the folktales, far from codifying a single version of dogma, were carrying on a dialogue among themselves about what is to be valued and believed. That belief was not enshrined somewhere beyond the stories, but was rather in the stories themselves, in the intertextual repartee among them. In retrospect, I realized how very fortunate my timing was that I had a chance to observe at close hand the workings of this still exclusively oral tradition. It was an interweaving of tradition and creativity that seemed to keep the society itself alive, so that individuals experienced their own lives as contributions to the shared reality. It seemed that past traditions were nothing unless they were alive, renewed today, now. Taken together, the ideas about healing power, about human relationships with weather and carnivores and food, and the events of the stories of transformation add up to a complex of belief that enables trance and the community healing on which the San's ancestors have relied for millennia. And as we have seen, this vast web or network of meaning was shared across thousands of kilometers in many click languages in the Kalahari, as we see from Helga's Buffalo Wife story in the far east with the Kua, and my Elephant Girl story in the far west of the Kalahari from the Jinkwasi. Yet importantly, I saw that these beliefs were always alluded to only indirectly through the intricately interwoven metaphors of dance, song, and story. And therein laid their strength. The Jinkwaa expressive forms glittered with powerful, but only briefly and delicately phrased allusions. I saw the whole then as a panoply similar to a vast, fine, deeply interconnected literature, and one that was fully embedded in its local environmental context. So I want to end this part of my presentation before we go on to discussions by reading a last excerpt from my memoir, one in which I address the great overarching story that all of these stories contributed to. I found that virtually every one of the Jinkwaa stories had some kind of reference, either direct or veiled, to the concept of Num. This is a meta-human power, as you know, a kind of spiritual energy. And one of the realizations that I came to about it was that it was something that was absolutely dependent on this whole communal form of creativity that I had stumbled into. I was a person who first went to the Kalahari thinking, oh, my job is to collect as many variants of these stories and get them into print as I possibly can. And that's the end of what I'm there to do. Well, it was a much bigger adventure than that. So the communally built Jinkwaa story of the ways and power of Num is but one of what must have been thousands of such stories told in human prehistory and into today. The Num story of the Jinkwasi is an example of the skeins of meaning generated about the unknown and tried out for efficacy by every culture. These are all well-honed artifacts built of the imaginings of generations of people sharing their ideas and experimenting with them on each other. These ideas grew and became embedded in the consciousness of various cultures as people performed acts related to them, and from seeing and valuing what achievements came out of the mysterious networks of meaning, healing, peace, social harmony, ecstasy. Each such story is a cultural jump beyond human limitations in the direction of what some call God. Each culture uses its own contemporary catapult of meaning to make its jumps. Not every jump succeeds, but those that do can become part of a specific canon, at least for a while. As in biological evolution, each story, each idea is a random existential experiment. Stories that work, that enable social cohesion, are among the most important intellectual achievements of humankind. The story the Jinkwasi told themselves over and over about their dance and about their Num, ringing the changes on its basic theme of healing, remains by constant renewal the powerful engine that made it possible for them to get along with each other. They told and danced and sang the story, incorporating the flashes of insight that occurred to different individuals in the process. The story lived in its never-ceasing variance, born of its enfranchisement of each participant of each new generation. It was always contemporary, or it was nothing. Westerners of the late 20th century have largely lost their connection to such powerful, jointly lived and jointly constructed stories. Thus, I felt deeply privileged to witness and even to participate in this still living, still breathing, ancient human process of meaning. It was a means of social control through shared joy that stayed ever contemporary because it valued each person's contribution. It contributed to the unspoken as well as the spoken consensus that made a reliable fabric out of the contentions and contradictions of their lives. Even my watchful outsider observer's presence could not interrupt the flow of this powerful synchrony. Its strength tossed me aside like a twig washed up on the banks by a river torrent. So I've reflected later that what was magical about these stories and the tradition of the stories is that storytellers were never just repeating a story rotely, but instead were performing it over again to a live audience that importantly included themselves. Maybe this is a good point to stop for discussion. I would be so interested to hear of other people's fieldwork experiences. They may be similar, they may be different, but any comments would be so welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this first part, Megan, and the sense of your feeling of the grandeur of the achievement and creativity of this individual performance, as well as the collective dialogue flowing through these stories. It's really wonderful to hear about it. Does anybody want to come in with questions or comments? We've got some wonderful contributors here. Anybody like to raise hand or say anything? Who's up? Matej. You want to unmute, Matej? Matej, unmute. Where's Matej? Is Matej speaking? Can we unmute?
Is that better?
Much
Much better.
Yes,
Okay.
that's better.
Okay. Yeah, my question was
That's
comments. The question were, sorry, on
Yep.
the exegesis component of your talk.
Start again.
Sorry, not working.
I can hear you.
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. Yeah, I had in my fieldwork and story collecting amongst the Naro and Hansi, one of my most knowledgeable and skilled storyteller, Kumaka, he told me actually the same, a variant of the same story, the elephant girl, and how her young brother, brother-in-law got her husband to kill her and eat her and so on. And what I found is that this story that Kumaka told me was part of another story, and which had to do also with elephant transformation, but not with the a different story altogether about people transforming, especially women, into elephants in the context of some. They had to leave a site and move to another site, and in the context of that, they transformed into elephants. So my question here about exegesis is, to understand the meaning, which is, as you say, extremely subtle and complex and multifaceted, it's important also, and I think you make this point in somewhere in your own publications, that one see a specific story in the context of other stories that preceded it in the same storytelling session, or in later storytelling sessions that then make reference to that particular story, and then stories that follow it, you know. So I think that's another important key in the exegesis. How does this particular story that you focus on as the analyst, link up with other stories, in this particular storyteller's repertoire, but also within the collective repertoire of stories, and yeah, well, that's my comment. I could illustrate it more with the article that I wrote on this, in which the connection was the human animal likeness, a merging of identities of human and animal.
That's a wonderful question, Matthias, and it's one that I've been breaking my head over for half a century. I don't think I have a good answer even yet. It was actually Mel Connor who made me aware that there were these many episodes of a multi-identitied heroine floating around, and he was in hopes that in my field work, after he and Marjorie Shostak left to go back home, and I was on my own, he was in hopes that I would be able to put together the entire story cycle. We use terms like that, and I was on fire to do that, because I thought, wouldn't it be terrific to know how this story fits together? It's like an epic, etc. And yet I never got it told in that way. It was only told to me episodically, and I felt that if I tried to stitch the episodes together in my own way, it would be an imposition of a kind of order that Junquasi were apparently not using, or maybe they were using it in other contexts that I had no idea about. Maybe they were telling them as short stories because something about the condition in which we were working. So I don't have a good answer to that, but it certainly is an intriguing question. I did get some interesting clues, though, to the relationships between the different heroines. As I've mentioned, aardvark, and elephant, buffalo, etc., and python. One time when an elephant story was being told to me, the storyteller made a slip, and she referred not to the elephant girl, but to the python girl. I said, "Oh, I thought you were talking about an elephant." And she said, "No, the python girl, the elephant girl, it doesn't matter. They're the same." And I, asking further questions about that, I got mostly statements about how much fat they both had. It's always good to have fat if you're going to be a Junquois heroine. So aardvark girls, eland girls with plenty of fat, pythons apparently have a lot of fat too, and buffaloes and elephants.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matthias.
Ian, do you want to go next?
Yeah.
Ian, unmute.
Yeah, I have. Actually, it was another suggestion.
Can you unmute?
I have unmuted. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah. maybe to come back to discussion afterwards, and maybe to just jump. You were off tantalizing, suggesting a take on Wengro and Graeber and Wengro. Maybe just to jump into that, and then come back to the stories through that. Unless there's but I see there are other people with field experience with hands up, so maybe not.
Okay, but interesting suggestion. We'll get there.
Yeah.
Okay, so is that enough, Ian? So Jerome?
Hi, well, thank you, Megan. That was an absolutely beautiful telling of the stories. And it's always just so lovely when you get that direct telling coming back. So thank you for sharing that, something you obviously learnt with your various storytelling retreat sessions, which sound absolutely wonderful. Something I want to try, a very nice methodology. What I was particularly interested in, and this is something just about the sort of the way that people in these very egalitarian societies where it's really rude to explicitly teach, encourage or create these items which are just confounding, and they just naturally sort of draw you in to start wondering, why on earth should this be the case? In the way that you, for instance, were confused by Buffalo Girl and Python Girl being very similar. But what I was particularly intrigued in your presentation was you talked about key unexplained metaphors. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that and perhaps give us some examples of the type of thing you mean, and how they work to intrigue and create that opportunity for the dialogue that these stories have with people's lived experience to occur. Thank you.
Thank you for that good question, Jerome. I hadn't really thought of it in exactly that way. I too am very excited about the relationship of the lack of didacticism to egalitarianism, and also, as you point out, this particular nexus there can have a wonderful effect on educating young people who may or may not already be familiar with all of the arcane circumstances of ritual, and they may not really have yet had all of their questions answered. So these are learning devices par excellence for the children without being in the slightest didactic, which Mel Connor has always pointed out. It tends to make hunter-gatherers and a substantial proportion of Western societies very annoyed and not learn very well if they feel something is being foisted on them. Yeah, but I guess one of the examples I could give is of the many ways that the stories that I collected referred to tortoises and their connection with magical medicine smoke that allows trance. One of the stories, Kauha goes to rescue his two sons who have been killed by lions and buried in a pile of the lions of the stomach contents, and they are pursued, by Kauha, the father, who is also the original healer, we find, for a long way, and he goes with a tortoise who is his familiar to attempt to find his two sons who had gone and killed an eland and then been killed by lions in turn and buried in the stomach contents of the eland. So at each successive fire, Kauha says to the tortoise, just poke your head into the coals and see if they're hot, and then we'll know how long ago they were here. And so the first one, it's totally cold, and so they keep going. And the next one, there's a little bit of warmth in the glowing coals. And in the third one, the tortoise sticks his head into the fire, and it was a living hot fire. And so his head was burned. And in fact, his whole self inside of his shell burned, and smoke came out of it and was inhaled by Kauha. And this caused him to have an altered state of consciousness. He then went into a trance for the first time. So when you get mentions of tortoises, and particularly tortoise shells with cooked tortoise inside, or oily substances that are emitting smoke, aromatic smoke particularly, you go into a whole world of not only the plot of this story, but to the implications of these substances and objects and items to creating the possibility that magic can happen, that Mum can happen. And this goes on and on, over and over and over again in the stories. And just as an aside, I'll say that David Lewis Williams, whom Ian Watts started his introduction with, has made note of many such what he calls nuggets, metaphorical nuggets in the rock paintings too. So I believe that these kinds of processes are operative in many media.
Thank you. That was wonderful examples. Yeah, really nice.
Thanks, Jerome. Anybody else?
Have we got anybody else asking? Because if not, I would put something in if there's nobody else. No. Yes, but it's been so interesting to hear your dissection of these stories as communicative acts, taking account of who are you communicating to, and therefore being so variable in their kind of direction and their emphases and their politics as well. They're so multifaceted. There's all this discussion of gender relations, human-animal relations, relations of in-laws, and and bride service, and all these layers, as well as all the illusions in respect of ritual, healing, first menstruation, women's blood, and so forth. And I'm really interested in the ways the difference is highlighted. The Helga's story, the exegetic and somewhat more didactic story, it does not seem to have as many episodes to it, or it becomes more kind of fixed than the versions that of The Elephant Girl, where there's a much more cyclical coming back to life and coming back to life. But we get the possibility of the roles changing between the brothers, including the uncanny brother, and the Elephant Girl herself, because it's the brother who is the one that flattens with the farts or the hoan. But in the Kua story, the Elephant Girl flattens the village of the brothers. So we can see how the reversal goes of the roles depending on the perspective. But could you say any more about this kind of cyclical nature of life and death, and the metaphors underlying that? Because the didactic version seems to bring the episode kind of to a halt.
It's such an interesting observation, because a lot of what I've been thinking about for so long is that it was my recording of stories at a moment of time and then fixing them in print, coming from tape into transcription, into print, was the form of the form of fixity that would be, less worthy of the tradition. And yet, you're absolutely right that it was through the inquiry that Helga was making in the moment, that when she heard the explanation, then the exegesis from the storytellers, that ended up making a different kind of fixity. Really, this is just such a fascinating observation. Thank you so much. And really, what you're making me realize is that the fact that I collected so many variants without interfering with them is what allowed me to know how massively multifaceted the tradition was, and responsive to the actual audience that was there. For instance, okay, I heard this version most often. These versions most often when I was recording them, they involved blowing on a magical Gemsbach horn or a different kind of horn. I was never told about the poison farts. I only learned about the poison farts from Helga, many years later. So I think that, there was this Victorian anthropologist there who was collecting the stories, and nobody wanted to talk to her about poison farts.
Yeah, that raucousness is something special. Yeah.
Yeah. The raucousness.
Any more suggestions? Yeah. And of course, it's absolutely there, but in the counter trick, Helga sequences, it's completely raucous. It's wonderful.
Yes, and think of it also this way. These were people who lived. These older people who came and stayed at my camp for a week or so. These were people who lived face to face with each other their whole lives. They had, whole histories of playing tricks on each other, on love affairs, infidelities. Who knows what was the substrate of some of those attitudes about tricks and the fun that people had with telling those things. It boggles the mind. Yeah. Good. Well, shall I move on to the second part then?
Let's go. Yes, please.
Okay. I finished writing my memoir shortly before I became aware of Graeber and Wengrow's book. So in this second part of my presentation, I want to say a few things in appreciation of the paradigm that book is suggesting that we consider. And I acknowledge and celebrate the fact that the paradigm is open-ended, it's unfinished, it's generative, it's promising for those reasons. I didn't get to attend all of the CHAG's sessions in Dublin, mostly because a lot of them were happening at 3 a.m. here and I didn't get up. But as far as I can tell, I was left with the feeling that the dawn of everything was inadequately celebrated at the CHAGs. I was also asking myself why the great Kalahari debate, or in fact, much of the Kalahari or hunter-gatherer research in general, did not get into the dawn of everything. I asked myself whether maybe Graeber and Wengrow did not want to further reify the hunter-gatherer category, but rather to emphasize the flexibility of all ways of life and the creative agency of human beings under whatever circumstances. And I also reflected that another way of looking at why the Kalahari did not much get into the dawn might have been that the huge Kalahari and hunter-gatherer literature has already been so enshrined in the general anthropological canon that the authors didn't feel the need to repeat all that, only to challenge it, which would have made their huge tome even bigger in any case. I also mused that perhaps they had bigger worldwide international fish to fry, and or that it was something they meant to get to, but it just didn't make it into the already lengthy volume. I didn't know the answers though, and in light of Graeber's untimely death just 3 weeks after the writing of Dawn was finished, I was just grateful that they had gone ahead and gotten the volume into print. At one point, I asked Megan Laws, who's now doing a postdoc at LSE, and she had worked closely with Graeber and Wengrow during the time that they were writing the Dawn. I asked her why, if she knew why hunter-gatherer studies, and particularly the Kalahari body of work and the Kalahari debate, were not included. She replied that this question had crossed her mind too when reading it, along with their early paper, The Childhood of Man. She speculated that maybe indeed there was just too much the authors needed to cover. And she also reminded me that they had intended to have multiple volumes. So I looked back at the introduction, and sure enough, Wengrow wrote in the foreword to the book that realizing many of the concepts introduced in this book would benefit from further development and exemplification, we plan to write sequels, no less than 3. But this first book had to finish somewhere. Thinking about these questions, I ended up agreeing with William Deresiewicz, who wrote a review in 2021 in The Atlantic called Human History Gets a Rewrite. Deresiewicz says, above all, this book is a brief for possibility, which was for Graeber perhaps the highest value of all. The book is something of a glorious mess, full of fascinating digressions, open questions, and missing pieces. It aims to replace the dominant grand narrative of history, not with another one of its own devising, but with the outline of a picture only just becoming visible of a human past replete with political experiment and creativity. Even without the sequels, I felt that many of the insights of this first book were consonant with what Richard Lee and I have called the lessons of the Jinkwasi. And these lessons that we tried to incorporate into our own work. I felt that the insights were consonant with my own engagement with San's stories and how I grew to understand them. So several friends and I here in Texas began reading The Dawn of Everything. And one friend asked me whether the book had dampened my earlier enthusiasm for hunter-gatherer studies. I then realized that far from any such reaction, I felt that my long interest in societies considered a hunter-gatherer and that of the Jinkwasi or Kung in particular was precisely what allowed me to appreciate The Dawn so much and to quickly open up to much of its new paradigm within the first few pages I read of that book. It had been, after all, in my acquaintance with Jinkwaa hunter-gatherers that I personally experienced living with individuals of a culture very different from my own, but like all human cultures, truly creative and flexible and resilient. This experience led me to readily accept the flexible, creative model of prehistoric human societies that Graeber and Wengrow propose, to replace the monolithic, limited, evolutionarily restricted model that has for so long held sway in anthropology. Graeber and Wengrow were asking that attention be paid to a kind of academic stagnation on this idea of the human story. And in some cases, they suggested ameliorations to this stagnation. So it was with a sense of very happy recognition that I read their proposed memories Many of them recalled notable sticking points in my own anthropological thinking that were overcome by similar solutions that I came up with either on my own or with help from friends, mentors, colleagues, or other guides, and particularly from the Jinkwasi themselves. So after discussions with my friends, I've assembled just a few of the many parallels between my thinking over the years, working year after year with the Jinkwasi, and that of Graeber and Wengrow. So I include some of the solutions that both I and they crafted to problems with the narratives by which contemporary others, as well as the extrapolations from them back into the human past, have become known in anthropology. As I said, many of the solutions were first conveyed to me through indigenous critique while I was doing the field work. And this was pretty radical at the time. So since I felt they were radical, I thought of offering them to this group. I'll just list them very, very quickly because I know we're running out of time. One was foregrounding indigenous voices and critique, striving to have indigenous voices heard, realizing and chronicling the exhilaration of daily life in a creative community, understanding that people do reinvent themselves and their social organization, particularly in studying individual lifetimes and politics. Undertaking and publishing cooperative ventures of recording and interpretation, advocating better collaboration between archaeology and ethnography, focusing on individuals rather than assuming society was monolithic. Eschewing statements like, well, the Jinkwasi think, because after all, the Jinkwasi are a group of individuals, and I found their talking with each other was much more a chorus of argument, never ending, than arriving at a monolithic statement of what they all think. The next similarity was melding research with activism, as Graeber did, and also Wengrow. There are some things that you can never know about a society unless you're actively involved. Trying to excise some of the circular arguments of capitalism and market economies, throwing out theories of social evolution that relegated hunter-gatherers and egalitarian peoples to the bottom of some ladder. In other words, regarding the myth of progress as suspicious, believing that people of prehistoric times had clear ideas about why they organized their societies in various ways, feeling that myths about simplicity and egalitarianism of hunter-gatherers have held sway precisely because they are based on biases in our evidence. For instance, there is much more archaeological material from 45,000 BP in Europe than from 100,000 BP in Africa. And also, so much of our ethnographic material came to us through filters like translators, interpreters, and from picking and choosing with romantic bias. The last thing that I'll mention is that finally seeing and understanding that social scientists, as well as the public, have been doomed to recycle the vision of hunter-gatherers as either Hobbesian or Rousseauian, with never a resting point in anywhere between these extremes. Basically, coming to see hunter-gatherer societies, like all societies, as far more complex and more varied than we've imagined. I conclude from the consonance between these important themes in anthropological thinking and practice that the myth anthropologists told themselves about the hunting and gathering paradigm, though now challenged by the dawn, did help us along the way to the explosion of good sense that the Graeber and Wengrow book is. I'm going to end by talking about indigenous critique. which to me was the most salient part of the entire book. Prominently featured, as you know, is the encounter between the French Jesuit missionaries and the native intellectuals, including the wonderful R.A.G, the Huron-Wendat chief in the Great Lakes region of what was then New France. These individuals, R.A.G and others, had inherited a tradition of debate and thought, and they pondered deeply on, quote, generosity, sociability, material wealth, crime, punishment, and liberty. The Jesuits, in comparison, and by extension, all French and European society, were condemned by this indigenous critique for, and I'm quoting Deresiewicz here, incessant competition, paucity of kindness and mutual care, religious dogmatism and irrationalism, and horrific inequality and lack of freedom. Speaking of indigenous critique, I'm going to end by reminding us of the figure in Helga's talk named Biesele. Remember, he was the healer who said that we can't know what happens to humans after they die, or in fact, anything about God or another world. It's not given to humans to know any of that. Now, where are those cigarettes you promised me? And I'm going to end with a parallel story from my own experience of the good sense of Juntois critique. This is another excerpt from the memoir I've just finished. I have many such stories from the political debates around the time of Namibian independence, but this story is one that is more relevant to our current discussion. Many years after my first field work, when I was back in the United States, an energetic middle school student in Cleveland named Aaron Cohn contacted me with a plan to bring a few Juntois leaders to Cleveland to speak to schools and colleges and on the media. He raised the finances for this as donations to the Kalahari People's Fund, the nonprofit I had founded with my Harvard colleagues in 1973. He arranged the visit and set up talks for the Juntois speakers for several days at TV studios, at his middle school, and at other educational institutions. One of the Juntois who came was a tiny man known by the Afrikaans name of Kivit, a small, bright, active bird, one of the many kinds of plovers that inhabit the Kalahari. Kivit was known for his eloquence in speaking in his areas of expertise, which were politics, storytelling, and healing. In Cleveland, he was to speak one evening at a historically Black college, and his topic was the intersection of these three domains. I felt privileged to stand with him at the podium as his translator. The venue was the gymnasium of the college, with the audience seated on risers. Kivit was much smaller and lighter skinned than almost anyone in the audience. The podium dwarfed him, and the microphone took a while to get arranged effectively. But he riveted the listeners with his account of the Juntois people's participation in the recent independence process Southwest Africa had gone through in becoming Namibia. He also talked about the practices and values of their healing religion with its sharing ethic and tolerance for all, and spoke of the healer's process of traveling to God's village on the threads of the sky. He explained how these ideas had underwritten and supported all that the Juntois had accomplished in terms of community organizing and communication with the new government during the independence process. Many in the audience could be seen taking out Kleenexes and wiping their eyes before the end of the story. After his speech, Kivit took a few questions. The last question came from a large Black woman on the third row of the risers. She stood up and said, "You said that you travel to God when you are in trance and are healing. Please tell us what God looks like." Kivit chuckled. "I have never seen God. Nobody can see God. All that human beings have is stories." Thank you for listening.
Lovely.
I think it's almost exactly 2 o'clock. I don't know if we have time for discussion, but I'm happy to stay if people want to.
Yeah, we have time if people want to carry on. For anyone who wants to, did anybody want to respond to this very heartwarming, generous response to the Graeber and Wengrow Dawn of Everything? Ian, did you want to say anything, or you were going to go for it before? Did you want to continue in there? Or does anybody else want to come back on that? Yeah, Megan, is your Indigenous critique going to be going into the memoirs, or are you writing this?
Some of it's in there already. It's in press.
Beautiful.
Jerome,
Jerome, did you want to?
Jerome's hands up.
Jerome, he's gone. He's gone.
Jerome, sound.
Sorry. Okay. I just wanted to really query a little bit your acceptance of the first chapter. I fully agree with you in the second chapter. I think that was a very profound and important contribution to really show just the impact of the way that different ways of understanding the world can really offer profound critiques. And I do think, in fact, that Jesuit papers were probably part of the process which really got us out of the dark ages of the Renaissance, which was just such an appalling time in Europe. But I don't feel the same about that first chapter at all. And I think that both Wengrow and Graeber fell prey to the very social evolutionary theories that they claim to be countering, because to assume that living as an egalitarian community is somehow boring. I mean, I can't remember the words now that they use in that chapter, but they really are insulting to the many hunter-gatherers that I've spent time with, who spend an awful lot of intellectual energy in maintaining the system of egalitarianism between their relations of egalitarianism, understanding who's been doing what, who's got what where, and how to get it from them without being too brutal or I mean, just the everyday politics of a camp of hunter-gatherers is a really challenging place. And I've certainly found that while we lived in the forest for several years with the Biaka, it was intellectually completely satisfying. I had no need for thinking about reading books or anything like that. It was just the everyday run of life was just really challenging, maintaining this egalitarian polity in a sort of relatively, and of course it's not always at all, harmonious way in terms of relationships. And the reason I thought that Graeber and Wengrow fell prey to social evolutionary thinking is the very presumption that living like that is some sort of simplistic ideological romanticization of anthropologists and doesn't really have a founding in the way that people live their everyday lives. And so anyway, I just wondered if you wanted to respond to that. But obviously that book provokes different reactions in different people. But I really did feel that they did a disservice to themselves and to the title of their book by dismissing the incredible achievements of egalitarianism in these societies, something we struggle to do in our own most disastrously.
Thank you so much, Jerome. I was hanging on your every word. I think you're absolutely right to bring that up. I'm sorry, I had forgotten that they used the word boring with reference to hunter-gatherers. And I agree with you. The longer I stayed with the Juntoisi, the more intricate and fascinating and intellectually challenging I found the ways that they were constantly challenging each other about how to be good egalitarians. I mean, these are fierce debaters, these folks, and and fierce watchers of each other to make sure that nobody is straying too far from prescribed norms, and yet maintaining a kind of intellectual flexibility about envisioning ways that problems can be solved. So thank you very much, and you've put it succinctly and very well. I'm just really hoping that that David Wengrow is going to carry on some of this, because we need to hear from him some more, I think, don't you?
Well, David and I, we're just in departments, so we have a lot of exchanges and discussions about this. And certainly, I think what he has, which is really important to contribute, is this deep understanding of the Central European societies, where there was incredible diversity and such interesting social formations. And this is, of course, what they focus on mostly in the book. But I think it's pretentious to claim that that's the dawn of everything.
Yeah. Thank
Anyway,
you.
We have our regular discussions, and we see eye to eye on some things and not others.
Well, do you think that these discussions may perhaps prompt a sequel?
Well, I think it's a lot to get on with just by yourself, such an undertaking. But I do hope, I mean, he's very productive, so I'm sure David will come up with some satisfying sequels. That's for sure.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, I hope that there's some appropriate way for you to convey my greetings to him.
Okay, I will do when I next
Not
week.
that I've ever met him or written to him or anything. I just know him a bit through the book.
Okay, well, I shall
Thank you,
do.
Jerome. Thank you, Jerome.
Pleasure. Thank you, Megan.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to come in? Ian, did you want to come in? Unmute. You
Can you
unmute?
unmute Ian, please?
On ways we might explore this debate further. I mean, I think you need to go back to Salin's article about why egalitarian societies aren't really egalitarian because they submit to gods, meta-persons. And although there certainly are meta-persons in amongst forest hunter-gatherers, Southern African hunter-gatherers, and very much so amongst the Hadza, they're pretty remote and don't have much involvement, and I'm not sure how well Salin's model actually works for African hunter-gatherers. I don't even think it works as well as he tries to make it work for the Chewong. And I think Sinye Howell also sort of disagrees with how he interpreted her fieldwork there. So
Well,
I mean, just on what you said about, I mean, the nearest we got to meta-persons in a sense was when the trickster smelt the tortoise's burning flesh and went into trance. So that would suggest that trance is one way that these other powers are sort of brought about, but you know, things were already up and running long before then, I think. Anyway, that's just speculation.
I'm glad you brought up Salin's and that particular point, and I'm glad that you have doubts about whether it really applies. His idea really applies to African hunter-gatherers, and I could say that the use of the word submit, that's not a word I would ever ever impute to the way San people that I'm aware of relate to any meta-human. They mostly chastise them and, you know, say, oh, you've done these dreadful things and you're stupid, etc. They call them pricks. It's just amazing. They're not submitting.
Yeah.
I think that's right. Chris, do you want to say something?
Yes. Ian's mentioned the Sardines article, which of course Graeber kind of wrote with a version of it. And so it's the basic idea of Sardines is that you can't have egalitarianism, and certainly hunter-gatherers aren't egalitarian because they have meta-persons, spirits, and so on, and these are actually kings. This is the word used. It's more than just simply. I mean, these are kings, and because they're kings, the reason they're kings is, according to Sardines, and then Graeber backs that up in his own version. The reason they're kings is because they have this sort of arbitrary power. You can just kill whoever you like because you're in a rage or something, and it's just such an extraordinary claim. I mean, and of course, the way Jerome described it is with his experience is to say, well, you know, the Biesele just say, well, we party with these kings, we make fun of them. They're a butt of jokes. There's no way in which you can identify a trickster with a king. It's just such complete nonsense. And yet that's the Graeber-Wengrow view, which they take from, you know, from Sardines among others. So I agree with Camilla's comments on your work, Megan. I mean, you're very, very generous and it's wonderful. And of course, all of us were just absolutely overjoyed. I mean, I've been long been a friend of David Graeber as an activist and so on. We were all absolutely overjoyed that this book broke so many taboos and released us from all sorts of weird narratives about, you know, ladders of evolution and so on. But I mean, the critical thing is that it was kind of racist to say that the dawn of everything is almost like saying that, you know, yes, okay, we evolved in Africa, but we didn't get smart till we hit Europe with the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. And of course, I mean, Ian's work in particular has shown that the dawn of everything, if by that you mean the sort of cultural explosion of symbolism and, you know, ritual and all the rest of it, all these things which make us uniquely human, that goes right back to in Africa, way before 40,000 years, goes back 140 to maybe even 200,000 years. I mean, Ian's got the dates on the Oka record. So it's just we were just rather disappointed in the way the magnificent scheme of the dawn of everything was just so marred, particularly with relationship to Africa. And it just has to be said that, you know, David Graeber just thought of the African hunter-gatherers as kind of lost people, as kind of, and didn't think there's anything to learn about the past by studying African hunter-gatherers, because in a sense you can't know anything about their past because they have an oral tradition and they don't, and they go on to say that only when you get hierarchy do you get sort of anything interesting going on. Otherwise, and they do actually say, I haven't got the quote here, I could read that, but they just say, if you're always egalitarian, then it's boring. It's much better to sort of mix your egalitarianism with moments of despotism and alternate between different forms of cannibalism, despotism, cruelty, and a bit of egalitarianism now and again. At least it's interesting. And of course, you know, I don't know, there's just so many things which are disappointing in the book, as Jerome's already said. So I do think you're being very generous, Megan, and it's lovely to be generous, but possibly you're slightly too generous.
May I just say, I take many of your points, but I want to focus on one thing, and that is the title, The Dawn of Everything. I think that I took that very much more as a kind of tongue-in-cheek joke about this whole anthropological enterprise of trying to come up with a history of humankind. That they were bringing that to the fore in order to joke.
Yes, they did take that title, The Dawn of Everything, from Mircea Eliade, who of course are not very fond of for all sorts of political reasons. But still, I mean, the way the book's been received is no doubt as if this is about the dawn of everything, and they kind of trace back symbolic culture to that point, to the European Upper Paleolithic. But, I mean, although it's kind of joke in a way, I'm afraid to title a book, to give that, you know, title to a book which is not about the Dawn of Everything was a kind of, I don't know, something unpleasant about it, really, given that African hunter-gatherers initiated the whole story of human creativity and mythology and culture. And there's just not a word of that in any part of that book. There's no attribution of that creativity to African people, just not there.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Do any more contributions, particularly more positive contributions on Grabe and Wengrow? I mean, I think, Megan, you're absolutely right that they have opened up so much space, and from that point of view, the book is, you know, it's hugely welcome and it's hugely important. It's just generated all these possibilities. We ran, a number of us ran a R.A.G session on Dawn of Everything. I don't know if you came into that and followed that on the Zoom. And
I
we
did,
were
yes.
well, we had a mixture of very positive as well as more critical. Did follow, yeah. So obviously, from our perspective, because of our real interest in the question African human origins as symbolic species, we kind of had a problem with this metaphoric use of Dawn of Everything. We talk about the book as the tea time of everything, actually, but you're absolutely right. They're making it a metaphoric question, yeah. But there are many other aspects to the book. And did Lieta, did you want to come in quickly? We're going to wind up in a short while, but Lieta, did you want to say something?
Yeah, not about the Dawn of Everything. I just kind of, I've been hanging on because this has been such an amazing talk, and there is so much, and I can't even sort of, I'm only starting to kind of process, and but what I was mostly touched by was the, you know, we're talking about egalitarianism, and we've been following R.A.G for a long time, and the egalitarian nature of the creative act and storytelling. And I'm going to have to go back, and I think I'm going to have to transcribe this lecture for myself, because this was totally amazing. And I've been writing lately as part of my research, as you know, and I've been writing about the creative act as a liminal act. In fact, a catalogue essay where I quoted Chris, and also, you know, initiations stuff, and thinking about, you know, how here the creative act as a, you know, as a myth making, as a seeking of meaning, because it's not a finding of meaning. This is what, you know, is amazing about it, that it is a seeking of meaning, which is not only egalitarian, it's embodied, it's performative, it's collective, and it's also mutual. It's non-didactive, it's non-totalizing, non-finding answers, but it's finding possibilities about answers, and how these stories, you know, all these different versions are not only that they're not exclusive, they're actually physically complementary, and they're complementary because of who tells them and who's listening them, and any combination thereof. And then all this process then becomes historical, you know, as Megan was saying, that it depending on who receives the story and at what point, you know, these stories are incredibly ancient, you know, so the seeking and the processing of meaning is never final, but it's totally, it's purely creative, because it's always generative, and also it's always shared. And this was, to me, mind-boggling, and you know, it's something that I've been really interested in my research lately. And as I said, I'm going to have to go back and re-listen and transcribe this, unless, you know, Megan can be so amazing and maybe share her lecture with us in written format. So thank you so much for this. So I hope this was a positive ending, you know, of things. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
lovely. Wait, Herbert, we maybe have a last contribution here.
Yes, this is probably the
Can you
least.
unmute?
Am I audible? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, this is probably the least informed comment that could possibly be made. I am not an anthropologist, but I'm deeply interested in these kinds of concerns. And I think that when they used the word dawn, they weren't thinking of the end of the darkness and the beginning of the light, like dawn is at 7:15 tomorrow morning. A better term might have been dawning, that I took the meaning of the title to refer to the flexibility and resilience and creativity of humankind, that it was from that fountain that things flowed forth recurrently, not at one particular point of departure. And so leaving out the Kalahari was bound to be annoying because of people who are deeply concerned about it. But I'm not sure that their idea was that those people were not part of the dawning.
Yeah. That's a very good comment, Walt. Yeah. Like that sort of comes under the heading of they were telling a more overarching story. They had bigger fish to fry, and they were not singling out the Kalahari for omission as such. Thank you. Yeah. Any other comments?
I've got one.
Anybody else?
Yeah. Can I come in for the
I
last one?
think we've just about reached. Hello? Anybody else?
Ian's there.
Yeah, come in.
No, on a yeah, again, a positive note. I think what your and Helga's work has done, like you did with David all those years ago, is shown the power of the comparative method, and that needs to be extended. So we need to start looking at forest hunter-gatherers and Hadza cosmology and comparing it with Kham and Juhasi cosmology. And, you know, there are clear, strong parallels, even down to tortoises and smell and, obviously blood. There's a lot of mileage there, and it's been out of fashion for many decades, but I think that's the way, in the spirit of Graeber and Wengrow, which is a comparative work after all, I think it would fill out the picture in a way that we're moaning about at the moment.
Exactly.
That sounds like a very good point to end, and an excellent comment.
Yes.
And I think we have our marching orders, or maybe those who are younger than I am have their marching orders.
Wonderful. Well, Megan, I can't say how much.
We need to close.
Yeah, I can't say how much this has been a special occasion for R.A.G, and it's just been a great privilege to hear from you, reading from the memoirs, and we are so looking forward to the publication and to be able to read and share those. That is going to be wonderful. So just thank you very much. I think everybody here is thrilled by the whole event. Thank you so much.
I had a lot of fun. Thank you for inviting me.
Well,
Yep.
top notch.
Yes. Thank you. Oh, blimey.
Thank you, everybody. I think we're going to end the recording, and thank you, everybody, for coming, and say good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, bye.
Right.